We have been listening to Vice President Kamala Harris at a campaign rally in Georgia. She was introduced by former President Barack Obama, marking the first time they have campaigned together. Now, in her remarks, she began, and we see them together on stage now, she said she repeatedly took on repeat offenders as a prosecutor, and she says in 12 days, it's Donald Trump's turn. She says it's time to turn the page on fear and divisiveness, and she wants to chart a joyful way forward. She says one vision that Americans can choose from is focused on the past and himself. That, of course, is that of her opponent, she believes, Donald Trump. The other focused on the future and you. She says she wants to bring down the cost of living, and that will be her focus every day as president. She also reiterated her support for reproductive rights. I want to go ahead and bring in CBS News congressional correspondent Nikole Killion, who is there. Nikole, set the scene for us. What's the energy like on the ground, and what did you make of her messaging today?
Yeah, well, I'd like to kind of show you the energy here. I don't know if we can show you a little bit, but kind of right over in that area, you've got Vice President Kamala Harris with former President Barack Obama in the crowd shaking hands. Everybody's kind of mobbing them, as you can imagine, trying to get selfies and pictures because this is the first time we have seen them campaign together. And this is really history right here, if you think about it. Former President Barack Obama, the first African-American president elected in the history of this country. And you now have Vice President Kamala Harris potentially on a path, hoping to make history again, not only as the first female president, but also the first woman of color to be the leader of the United States. So having them side by side like this is certainly a Kodak moment for a lot of people right now in the crowd who are very enthusiastic. And that really is what this rally was about, trying to generate and gin up that enthusiasm among the Democratic base, but also try to extend the message more broadly, not only here in Georgia, not only to the Sun Belt, but throughout the country to those voters who may still be on the fence to support the vice president. That certainly was a key part of former President Barack Obama's argument tonight, trying to address maybe some of the reasons people may not want to support the vice president at this point, or maybe leaning towards the former president, or may not want to vote altogether. The former president, Obama, kind of ticked through some of the excuses, if you will, that he's been hearing in terms of maybe people being disinterested in politics or not thinking it works for them, and trying to kind of talk through that and explain why their vote matters and why it's important to get out there. And also, both he and the vice president tried to draw contrast with former President Donald Trump. The vice president talked extensively about how she continues to believe that he is unhinged and unstable, referencing former President Donald Trump, and how she wants to chart a new path forward and create this opportunity economy and agenda for Americans writ large. She also spent a lot of time talking about her vision for reproductive rights and talking about how a lot of these abortion restrictions around the country are really impacting women, and how she eventually would like to codify protections for women writ large into law, that she would sign that bill into law if it were to pass through Congress. So those were a couple of the key themes that both of them hit on tonight, and certainly a message they hope to carry forward over these next 12 days.
Nikole, I thought it was interesting that she said the stakes are even higher than 2016 and 2020. Both she and former President Obama made the case that essentially they believe Trump is becoming more unhinged, and that while he may have surrounded himself before with people who, in their words, could control him, that now essentially he is surrounding himself with yes people. I mean, is that something, a consistent message that we're hearing on the trail on the Democratic side?
Well, certainly it was referenced here in this rally tonight. Both the former President Barack Obama and Vice President Harris made reference to this new interview this week by John Kelly with the New York Times, where he said that he believes the former President Donald Trump would govern like a dictator, that he meets the definition of a fascist, that he spoke favorably about Adolf Hitler. So both former President Obama and Vice President Harris raised that issue with respect respect to John Kelly's comments saying that if the former president were to win a second term, that in their view, he wouldn't have those types of guardrails, and that should be concerning to the average voter out there. In fact, former President Obama talked about the fact that, some of these individuals worked under his administration, in terms of Mark Milley, the former Joint Chiefs of Staff, he talked about the fact that these are very honorable men, is his view. Of course, Mark Milley also has referred to former President Donald Trump as a fascist. So, in former President Obama's view and the vice president's view, they feel if these are people who work closely with former President Trump, if anybody should know how he might govern, it's these men, and that voters should take them seriously. I would note, having covered the former president, Donald Trump, just yesterday in Georgia, for his part, he has certainly pushed back against a lot of this language, falsely accusing Vice President Harris of calling him Adolf Hitler. But, former President Trump, for his part, has made clear that he too wants to turn the page from the administration of Biden and Harris, and that has been a critical part of his closing argument as he too tries to make inroads here in Georgia. He's out west, of course, right now, but certainly there are two competing, contrasting visions from both of these candidates about how they want to lead this country.
Nikole Killion, thank you.